So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the November RR-CLaN seminar. This brings us to our last RR-CLaN seminar for 2024, and it's been an action-packed year. My name is Dr. Zoe Micallef, and I'm the Research Operations Manager for Northern New South Wales Local Health District. With us today, we have Nicola Yates, who is the Director of Project Management and Service Commissioning with Southern New South Wales Local Health District, and she'll be presenting today, No Wonder We Are Lost, The Map is Upside Down, a guide to stakeholder mapping. I'll introduce Nicola in a little bit more detail shortly, but first, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands and waters where we work and live. We acknowledge the traditional custodians' living culture, their connection to country and their contribution to the life of this region and the region that you're attending from. We pay our respects to the ancestors and elders of the region and to all Aboriginal people past, present and future, and to any Aboriginal people joining us here today. So welcome. I'd like to say a big thanks and shout out to our sponsor, the University Centre for Rural Health in the Northern Rivers, who has been supporting the delivery and operations of the RR-CLaN seminars for 2024. So thank you. In case you're not familiar with the RR-CLaN or are yet to stumble across us, the Rural Research Collaborative Learning Network, otherwise known as RR-CLaN, is a collaborative partnership comprising of 10 New South Wales local health districts, the New South Wales Health and Education Training Institute HEDI, the Tropical Australian Academic Health Centre, and 8 Queensland Hospital and Health Services, and the Darling Downs Health and Innovation Collaborative. The RR-CLaN is a grassroots-led initiative that aims to provide high-quality research in education and training to healthcare staff working in rural, regional and remote areas. And our aim is to provide you with the education and training opportunities to build skills in how to use and undertake research to ultimately improve the care that you deliver to your patients and communities. In case you've missed any of the action from this year or even previous years, or are keen to revisit any of the presentations, you can do so by visiting our RR-CLaN YouTube channel. You can find us either by just typing in RR-CLaN YouTube into your web browser, and otherwise I'll pop the link in the chat shortly. We do record each and every session to put onto the YouTube channel, so please, if you're able to, keep your microphones muted during the session, and if you don't wish to appear on the recording, please just turn off your cameras. We love interaction from the audience, so please feel free to ask questions. If you've got a question throughout, please direct it into the chat in the first instance. And then, time permitting, we'll open the floor up for questions at the end. So Nicola's got us a questions page that you can direct questions to, but there are a few questions that we'd love to get your input and feedback throughout. So then Nicola can gauge a level of understanding and engagement with the session. So that brings us to me introducing today's presenter. So Nicola Yates is the Director of Project Management and Service Commissioning with Southern New South Wales Local Health District. Nicola has 30 years of experience in health, local government and multi-agency partnerships, gained both here in Australia and in the UK. Nicola has a background in joint commissioning, health planning and operational health management, and she has a strong focus on improvement and is responsible for the district-wide strategic leadership and frameworks for service development and commissioning, project management and interagency collaborations and partnerships. I'd like to now hand over the reins to you, Nicola, and welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zoe, for that wonderful welcome. Good afternoon, everybody. I won't repeat my introduction. Zoe's done a great job, but I would just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which I live and work, which is the Narragansett country down in the Snowy Mountains. I'm based in Cooma in the Southern New South Wales Health Local District, and it's actually raining today for the first time in a long time, so that's very welcome. I'm just going to share my screen, and whilst I'm doing that, I will hopefully you will be able to see that just shortly. I shall just get my Teams back up so I can see everybody. I am running 2 screens, so please don't be put off by the fact that I might be turning my head as I look from slide to slide. I do have to remember what I've written on there that I want to talk to you about today. Hopefully that's not too, it's not too distracting. Today I'm going to talk to you about stakeholder mapping. It is a basic introduction to stakeholder mapping. It can be a very complex subject, particularly when you get into high level and very detailed and high risk projects. What I want to try and do today is to give you a basic introduction, but not to do so in a way which prescribes any particular way that you should do stakeholder mapping or to prescribe any particular method or tool. There are many and varied, and it's really important that you find one which is relevant to your work and relevant to the type of things that you are wanting to achieve, whether that be a research project, project management, innovation, improvement. And so I want to give you some benefit of my, I guess, experience and understanding of the stakeholder mapping that I have done in recent years, and also really focused on why stakeholder mapping is important, the what of stakeholder mapping in terms of how you go about it, and the key steps, without necessarily saying you should use this particular tool or this particular process. I will give you a couple of examples just to get you started. Once I've run through some of the kind of theory and the principles, I will share with you a very basic example of how it works in practice. There'll be an opportunity for you to interact in that part of the session, and then hopefully we will have plenty of time for questions and some discussion at the end. So, hoping that my presentation is going to work. If somebody could give me a thumbs up to say that the slides have moved.
We can see them, yep, and they're moving on. Thank you, Nicola.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so what I'll cover is what is stakeholder mapping and why do it? That's probably the most important thing. Who are our stakeholders? So how do you identify them? Why do they matter? So that categorisation into particular groups and prioritisation. How do you actually get them on board? So what are the key things you need to remember when communicating and engaging with stakeholders? Where did the roadblock come from? That dreaded kind of blocker in the way when you thought everything was going so well, how to anticipate that and plan for that so that you can try and remove that risk. And then some tools and resources at the end that might help you. So I'll start with a couple of definitions. So what is a stakeholder? Many and varied means different things to different people depending what you're doing, but I think we can all say that we all have stakeholders, particularly in public service. So a stakeholder is a person or an organisation who has something to gain or lose as a result of the outcomes of a project, programme or process. That could be anything. It could be direct patient care, it could be major building projects, it could be broad-scale research. I'm going to talk to you today from a research lens specifically, given that we're here with the R-CLaN, but I'm hoping that you will get something from this which you can apply in different processes across the work that you get involved in. So what is stakeholder mapping? It's identifying each stakeholder and assessing their impact or influence over the project and its outcomes. It's also about determining whether they are a primary, so very directly involved in the project, or secondary stakeholder. When you get more into more complex stakeholder mapping models, we also have tertiary, quaternary, the list goes on. You can become very complex, you can group people, link people, etc. We're not going to do that today. We're going to start small, but you can take this as far as you want to. So why is it important? With any project, whether it be a research project, you might be developing a proposal, you may be wanting to translate something you've learned from a research project into actual service delivery, to change a model of care or to introduce a new way of working. When you understand your stakeholders and the role that they play in the success of your research project, you can plan to manage that stakeholder involvement, manage their expectations, and also anticipate and manage any resistance and develop your timeline and your communications plan accordingly. If I use an example of in the early days when I was a commissioning manager in the NHS in the UK, getting to the end of where you think you're about to sign on the dotted line to get an approval for funding for a new service, for example, and right at the 11th hour, somebody asks you a question: have you consulted with Dr. X? Because if you haven't, this is going to have a major impact on their work, and they're a major promoter of what you're trying to achieve. So if they're not on board, we can't give you an approval today. There is nothing more disheartening than finding out that you've missed the opportunity to have somebody engaged and gain their support. Very disheartening, a lot of wasted time, and sometimes can be the end of all of that work that you've put into getting to that point. So engaging your stakeholders early, ensuring that you continue to communicate with them throughout the process and that you work with them to identify any particular challenges, to unblock any barriers, and to ensure that they remain supportive and engaged is absolutely critical to project success. So stakeholder mapping is absolutely an iterative process. It's not something you should do once, either at the beginning, middle, or end of a project. It is something that you should continue to revisit right the way through your research project or change project cycle to make sure that you continue to reassess where the support is coming from, where the sponsorship is coming from, and then potentially where the barriers and challenges may come from. So the risk of not mapping is essentially failure. If you fail to plan, then you plan to fail. Nobody wants to do that. So a little bit more of the why and what benefits you will get from doing good stakeholder mapping. So it can help you better understand and organise your stakeholders, so you can group them into like groups, making sure that you're having like conversations with people, not repeating yourself. If you've got a group of stakeholders who have common interests, you can bring them together and talk to them as groups. Supporting stakeholder management and engagement objectives like getting the permission that you need to continue with the research project, identifying the resources and the support that you need to proceed. One of the biggest challenges we see in the research space is obtaining permission to actually spend time, which obviously costs an organisation money, or to utilise resources, whether that be staff resources or financial resources, to actually progress your study. So you need that permission, and you need to engage the stakeholders that can give you that permission. Sometimes you will be asked to provide evidence of engagement. So who have you spoken to? What have you spoken to them about? What was their response to the questions that you asked them? Is often critical when you're applying for grants, looking for ethics and governance approvals, obtaining funding. You improve efficiency by mapping your stakeholders, so you can anticipate early the risks and delays to a particular project, and you can plan for those delays and factor them into your timeline, making sure that your timeline for your project is more realistic and you don't get unplanned for delays which potentially risk your outcome. You can identify stakeholder interests to ensure that they will support success, and you can avoid conflicts. So you don't get part of the way through developing a research proposal to then find that somebody else is doing something which is completely at odds with what you're trying to go, where you're trying to go. You can identify that early. You can develop a more comprehensive list of potential stakeholders. So if you're starting your stakeholder mapping early, there will be several points throughout your process where you will need to redo that stakeholder mapping, and there will be different stakeholders which come into play at different times. So you can start to anticipate that, and again, plan to communicate early with those stakeholders to get them on board as early as possible. You can then make sure that your frequency of engagement with those stakeholders meets your needs, and also, more importantly, meets their needs to make sure they stay engaged and supportive. By talking to your stakeholders, you can identify the most effective and efficient engagement strategies. We all know a busy manager who doesn't have time to hear our research proposal from start to finish. So how do we make sure that we give them pertinent information which is relevant to them? And then it helps us adapt to responding and changing needs and priorities over time. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. So if only we could move through these processes that you see on the left-hand side in a way which makes sure that we anticipate every risk, every barrier, and we have a plan for that. So the model that you see here is essentially a basic research kind of design process. So you'll go through conceptualisation and study design, writing your proposal. You'll need to seek sponsorship and authorising to allow you to continue. You'll need to seek, in most cases, some form of ethics and governance approval. You'll then need to implement your research project, so actually getting your research study done, and then hopefully at the end of that, good evaluation, translation, and what we all want as researchers to actually spread and scale that across a broader footprint or portfolio. So stakeholder mapping is useful at each point of these, and different stakeholders will come into play, as I mentioned. So the steps that we need to go through are to map those stakeholders, so we identify them. We then need to analyse each stakeholder in relation to what their interests and needs are, what power and influence they might have, which I will talk about in more detail. We then prioritise those stakeholders. So who do we need to engage first and who do we need to pay most attention to? We then work out how best to engage those stakeholders, and then we can work out how we manage them throughout the process. How many times do we need to re-engage? When do we need to check back in with them? What information and feedback do we need to continue to provide to keep us on track? So where do we start? If we're going to start to map stakeholders, we need a model. Please don't try to read the diagrams on the right-hand side. They are simply there to illustrate to you that there are some quite complex stakeholder mapping models out there. There's a model for every particular preference, whether you like lots of colour, whether you like lots of circles, whether you need connecting lines and dots, you want to visualise people, or whether you want to visualise functions or particular priorities. So the two models on the left are just to illustrate examples of the types of stakeholder maps you can create. There are many and varied mapping models and tools. I'm not going to prescribe any particular one and say it's the best one. I have used many over time. Some particular projects or research methodologies might recommend or suggest that you use a particular one. But in this particular instance, Google is your friend. If you put stakeholder mapping tools into a Google search, you will be pretty quickly overwhelmed with choice. My suggestion is choose one that appeals to your thinking and learning style. So if you're a very visual person, then choose something which is visual. If you like complexity and you want lots of different, descriptors and connecting dots and lines which evidence relationships, there are plenty of tools out there for you to use. If you want something more simple, and I'll give you a simple example today, then choose something which is kind of more linear and quadrant-based to start you off. Start small and basic. There's no point using a great big sledgehammer to crack a small nut. So choose a tool which is specific to the type and size of project, research proposal, etc. that you are developing. There is time in the future for you to get into the nitty-gritty of complex stakeholder mapping and management. And there'll be a tool and a method out there for that, and I'm also going to make some suggestions to you if you do want to take your learning any further. There are a couple of pathways that I could recommend that you have a look at to do that. So you've chosen a model which is going to help you actually record your stakeholders, whatever that might look like. You can have a big blank sheet of paper to start you off. You can write things on Post-it notes, stick them on a wall, move them around, etc. Whatever works for you. We begin to map by brainstorming to identify who our stakeholders are. And in identifying stakeholders, we ask ourselves, who are they? What's their name? What's their position? What's their organisation? Some of the questions you'll see on the wheel on the right-hand side will help you to identify your stakeholders. So who can make decisions? Where am I going to have to go through to for the permission to actually continue with my project? Who is this project going to affect? So if you're going to be doing research into a particular patient cohort or a particular model of care, you might identify patients as a stakeholder. You might identify staff as a stakeholder. There may be different groups of staff within that, different professional disciplines, different locations, for example. Start to jot all of this down. Don't worry too much at the initial stage about categorising or prioritising. You really just want a brain dump of everybody that you can think of that may have a role to play in the development of your project. You can then start to group them together. So your internal stakeholders versus your external stakeholders, you might need a different communication method for those. Who are the people that might be affected by your research or project versus the people who are not affected but may have a vested interest in what you're actually doing? And probably the most critical to progressing in the first instance is who are the people that have power over whether your project is allowed to proceed or not? Who are the people that have no power but have a lot of interest in what the outcome might be for your project? You can spend a lot of time on this brainstorming, and it is really knowing when you've got enough to start with. You can always come back and start to add stakeholders through different parts of your process. On the right-hand side here, you'll see a couple of slides that I have shamelessly stolen from the Clinical Agency for Clinical Innovation Accelerated Implementation Methodology Training. And I'm going to provide the link to the ACI webpage at the end of this presentation. So if you are interested in learning more about this, you can find out more from the ACI. One of the things I do, aside from my day job, is I am an accredited trainer for accelerated implementation methodology. And so I wanted to share this with you just to start to distill how you might further categorise your stakeholders. So people who have influence or people who are champions of the cause are really important to identify. Those people that can actually support you with having conversations higher up the chain, having conversations sideways, supporting you to move into, for example, a conversation with a partnership, collaboration with an academic institution, for example. You've got people who support you and would potentially be change agents. So if you want to implement a research project in a clinical setting, your change agents are the people in that clinical setting who are actually going to be conducting research on your behalf. They might be running a protocol for you. They might be identifying patients to come into your research study. It's important you know who they are. And then your authorisers and sponsors, and the accelerated implementation methodology goes into great detail about how to have good conversations with sponsors and contract with them so that they continue to be your supporter and sponsor of your project. Probably the most important point from this slide is everyone starts off as a target. So mapping your stakeholders, you're identifying your target audience for the people you need to have some kind of conversation with, regardless of what that conversation might be. So you identify your targets and then you start to put them into categories in terms of who are your authorisers and sponsors, who are your change agents, who are your champions, and then of course that dreaded group. Where is my resistance going to come from? Who are my resistors going to be? There's a little bit of a funny cartoon down the bottom there, which is resistance comes in all shapes and forms, and you never quite know where it's going to come from or how it's going to manifest. But hopefully we can help you start to anticipate that. So then we start to talk about influence and interest. So once you've categorised your stakeholders, you've worked out, where they kind of sit, how much impact, how much they might be impacted by the particular project. We then need to determine how much power or influence do they have over the project, and then what level of interest do they have in the project. And the simplest way to do this is with a simple quadrant matrix. So you'll see on the left-hand axis, power and influence of stakeholders. So the lower the power and influence, you would put them down in the bottom left-hand corner. The higher the power or influence, you would move them up to the top. And I'll explain the difference in communication strategies in a second. Along the bottom, we've got level of stakeholder interest. So how interested are they in my project? Again, low interest, you put them on the left. High interest, you'd keep them over to the right. And obviously those with high power and high interest, you want them in the top right-hand corner. And they are the people that you need to pay most attention to and have the most engagement with throughout the life of your project. When I move into an example in a couple of minutes, I'll also talk about how power and interest can change over time and why you need to adapt your communication strategy accordingly. So in trying to place your stakeholders into this grid, you ask yourself, what is their interest in this project? What influence or power do they have? What impact is this project actually going to have on them? That's when you can start to think about, if the impact is potentially negative from their perspective, that's where your barriers or blockers could come into your way. And how does that then enable you to develop your communication and engagement strategy to start to address some of those at the outset? This is just another way of categorising your stakeholders. So for those people who like spreadsheets and linear and you like more words rather than diagrams, this is just a simple example that I've taken from the toolsfordevelopment.org website, which essentially lists the name, the contact details, the impact. So you assess impact as to high, medium or low in relation to how this project is going to impact that person. What influence do they have? How much power do they have over whether I proceed with this project or not? Again, high, medium or low. What's important to them? How could they contribute to the project? And how could they block the project? So making a note of what all of those things are, which you will develop not only from your initial analysis in terms of your brainstorming session, but also when you start to have conversations with people, you can flesh this document out in terms of capturing those things which are of interest or of concern to people. This then enables you to determine the priority for your stakeholder engagement. So in the early stages, anybody that's coming up as high impact, high influence is really the person that you need to be engaging with first, or at least in that first tranche. It also allows you to record what your strategy for engaging that stakeholder might be. Some people are happy to have a conversation. Other people have a need for more facts and figures, detailed information, dollars, statistics, etc. You can work out from those conversations what information is going to be really important to that person. Once you've gone through that process and you've prioritised your stakeholders and you start to develop your communication and engagement plan. So with any good action plan, who do you need to engage with? When do you need to engage with them? What are the critical time points? Work out when the decision points in your project are going to be and work backwards from that. So if you know you're progressing to an ethics and governance application and there's a deadline to meet, the people you need to engage within that, you obviously need to start those conversations early to allow you to engage with them, receive feedback, make any modifications that you might do based on advice that you were given, and then circle back to them before you actually need to make a formal submission. Doing this early will improve the chances that you have success at your first application and your timeline's not affected by having to resubmit or re-request approval. When you're communicating and engaging with people, work out what do you need from them. Many people are time poor. They've got lots of other priorities to think about. Your main priority is not necessarily their priority. So making sure you follow those 7 C's of communication, which I won't go through in great detail, but being concise, being really clear, being considerate of that person's needs, being very correct with the facts and figures that you give them, and communicating with confidence, making sure you explain clearly what do you need from them. What information have you got available for them to help them give you what you need? And then more importantly, what expectations are you generating from that communication? So if somebody agrees to do something for you, agrees to support, what are they expecting in return in relation to regular feedback, updates, something that you need to change in the way that you've developed your proposal? Be very clear about what the expectations are, and then what further communication. So clear about when am I going to come back to you? Do you have a deadline that I need to meet? Making sure that those expectations can be met and that you're building trust and rapport in that relationship with that stakeholder. Nobody wants to go into a situation and not have clear communication about why they're actually there and what's needed from them. So the dreaded resistance. When you're doing your stakeholder mapping, anticipating and planning for resistance, you can ask yourself a number of questions. So think about things from your stakeholders' point of view. You're asking them for something, whether it's sponsorship, whether it's resources, whether it's just support in terms of what you're doing. What's in it for them? We always like to get something out of every interaction we have with people. What's the risk for them? And how can you communicate in a way that tells your stakeholder, I've thought about the risk for you, I've thought about the benefits for you, and here is the information I can provide you to try and allay some of those concerns. So trying to anticipate some of those things will put you in good stead, showing the stakeholder that you have considered them and what's important for them, rather than just coming from your own personal perspective. The list down the right-hand side is some common reasons why resistance occurs. So if you're recommending that there be a change to a well-established process, then you're likely to meet resistance from people who favour the status quo. Many people are fearful of change, fearful of the unknown. And so if you're suggesting there might be a new or better way to do something, then you will meet resistance for those people who feel quite comfortable or think that there's nothing wrong with the way that we do things now. If you're doing research, for example, into a new model of care or a new care modality, and that is going to impact on somebody's job security because it might change what they actually do day to day, again, that is likely to generate resistance. You may generate resistance or come across resistance because of political direction. So that never-ending cycle of government changing, new political promises, political priorities, etc., impacts on what we do every day. And so if something that you're suggesting actually is in conflict to any of those express priorities that we're working on as an organisation, as a health service, then you're likely to have a hard time navigating that resistance. There's obviously industrial concerns. You may be speaking to somebody who doesn't have the authority to give you a decision. And so again, that's a reason you would go back to your stakeholder mapping to make sure you've identified the right people who can give you that permission to continue. Budget and resource limitations is probably a major one we've all come across. Potential risk to the reputation of the organisation is one which sometimes people don't think about. And then obviously we have the risk of compliance with policy, regulatory and compliance concerns. That's not an exhaustive list. It's just a suggestion of the things you might start to ask yourself when you're considering where stakeholder resistance may come from. So how do you get buy-in, knowing that you are going to experience resistance and knowing that everybody will view your project or your proposal from their lens, not from your lens? How do you achieve buy-in? One of the main ways to achieve buy-in is to allow influence. So by allowing influence over research or project design, you can move more quickly to a position of sponsorship and buy-in from an authorising sponsor, from a supporter, from a champion. And there's a bit of a quote there on the right-hand side that says there's no such thing as good ideas and bad ideas, only your own and other people's. And if you really want somebody to like an idea, tell them it was their idea. We all like our own ideas better than anybody else's. And we often view things from the perspective of, if we believe something to be true, then we like the idea. If we don't think it's true, we possibly won't like it. So how do you move somebody into thinking that this is a good idea and it's something that, maybe an idea that they've had all along? You're just exploiting that idea and taking it to the next level. So allowing influence over design, incorporating other people's ideas into your project or proposal to address their concerns and potentially remove the barriers that they may put in your way. Another key way to achieve buy-in is to make sure that any proposal you take to somebody is aligned to strategy and objectives. An authorising sponsor, a decision maker or a champion is unlikely to give you support for something which flies in the face of what it is that they are personally trying to achieve. So when you're mapping your stakeholders, think about it from the perspective of what is the role that they hold and what are their responsibilities. For example, the finance director is responsible for the money in any particular organisation. And so that person is going to want to make sure that any resources you have access to are spent within, the appropriate finance governance policies, or if there are no resources in terms of financial resources, what are the in-kind resources and what impact is that going to have on the organisation? If you're in a situation where resources are tight, they're really going to want to make sure that there's no risk to that financial position from anything that you are proposing. So really think about the person's own objectives in the work that they do and how can you align what you're proposing to them with something which is going to have mutual benefit for both of you. Being aware of what's happening in the future, horizon scanning. Is there an election coming up? Is there, a new hospital being built down the road? Is there some research happening somewhere else which, is potentially going to provide support or not for the proposal that you are putting forward? Develop your study design or your project design to anticipate and address those blockers and barriers. And you can do this by using smart statistics, making sure that you research your evidence, where is the rationale for what you're actually proposing. Make sure that that's sound, it's factually correct, and it's presented in a way which addresses your stakeholders' concerns up front. The other way to effectively engage with your stakeholders is to ask, don't tell. So really come at your conversations from a position of appreciative inquiry. Ask questions of them rather than telling them just what you want from them. Ask them what's important to them. Seek to understand them better in terms of what their concerns are, how you can improve your design to better meet their needs, as well as achieving the objectives of your proposal. What do they think the barriers and success factors might be? They may give you a pearler of information in terms of where resistance might come from that you'd not thought of. And then how often do they want to hear from you? There's nothing worse than, 25 unread emails from the same person on the same subject that you don't have time to read. And then when you do open one of them, there's 5 pages of information for somebody who's extremely busy and has lots of other competing priorities. So being very clear with them that you'll communicate in a way which suits them and fits into how they manage their work on a day-to-day basis. So link your communication to the time they have available and the interest area in their particular project. Be succinct and pertinent. Perhaps more importantly is to ask yourself, how fixed are you on your original idea? So if you are going to approach a stakeholder conversation and genuinely allow influence over design or outcome, how is that going to compromise your original idea for your research proposal or project? How much are you prepared to allow influence over design, the process, the intended outcome in order to get that sponsorship and support? If it's something which fundamentally doesn't sit right with you in terms of your own principles, philosophy, where you want to go as an individual, as a professional, then it's probably not worth it and you should probably go back to the drawing board. There is nothing worse than having a really great idea and having somebody change it to the point where it really doesn't feel like it adds value to what you were trying to achieve in the first place. So be very honest with yourself and ask, at what point does this become not viable for me as a researcher or as a change agent to progress this? I don't like cats, so I wouldn't compromise on having a cat. No offence to any cat people that might be in the audience. I'm very much a dog person. Probably something which we've all come across, the dreaded changing appetites. And I'll use a little bit of an analogy here. So today I think it would be a great idea if all nurses on the front line could wear pink hats, just because it seems like a good idea. I go to my authorising sponsor. He's got a bit of money stashed. He can buy me a whole heap of pink hats. Thinks it's a great idea. Let's go and buy everybody a pink hat. So I go away to get some quotes for pink hats. I come back next week to provide the quotes. I can get you 100 pink hats for $25. And he seems to have changed his mind. He doesn't seem very keen anymore, and I don't really understand where that's come from. He was pretty keen last week when I spoke to him. Something's happened in the background, and what actually happens is there's a directive from, Treasury, pink hats are banned, but that's embargoed because we don't want to upset anybody who's already bought a pink hat until we can give them an alternative. So he can't tell you why he no longer wants to support your project. This happens all the time in health, perhaps not that simplistically, but it happens all of the time. There is nothing more constant than change. And this is why it is extremely important that you don't do your stakeholder mapping once. You need to circle back, and you need to circle back frequently. You need to check understanding. You need to make sure that people's priorities have not changed. Today's sponsor could very easily become tomorrow's resistor. So, on that note, and I am very conscious of time, Zoe will be hoping that I can get through this with time for questions at the end. I just want to work through a little bit of an example with you. So Rodney Research has got an idea. You can read the idea there on the screen, hopefully. He's drafted his proposal and he's ready to share his idea. He's right at the beginning of his journey. Just put in the chat for me. I'll give you about a minute to do this. Who do you think are the top 5 key stakeholders that Rodney needs to consider? Great, that's somebody put patients first. Fantastic. Yep. They're going to be many and varied. Lots of different potential stakeholders, depending how small he's going to start, depending, how many patients he wants to see, depending what great ideas he has for his research study. We've got some suggestions here: patients, finance, management, staff, all relevant. Any stakeholder map is individual to your project. It's not for me to say that any particular stakeholder is right or wrong. If it's somebody that comes up for you, then it's somebody you should pay attention to and you should go through your analysis process. But great suggestions coming in the chat. So let me make sure my slides move on. This is Rodney's first ever stakeholder map. We've identified 6 stakeholders. So we've got Dottie, the district Donham, Freddie from finance, Polly the patient, Sally the statistician, Harry from HREC, Human Research Ethics Committee, for anybody who doesn't know the acronym, and Charlie from clinical governance. So there's a couple of questions down the right-hand side there. Who has the most power here? And who has the least? Who is most likely to be the sponsor? Share your thoughts in the chat for me. Yep. So we've got Charlie, HREC, clinical governance. If ethics don't approve, it won't happen. Depends on the company culture and policies. Absolutely. Again, this will be different for every project and for every stakeholder map that you do. It will also change over time. So levels of power and influence will change over time depending on what stage of the process you're up to. Sponsorship might change over time. It might be a sponsor through development stage. It could be a different sponsor through implementation stage. These are all things which you need to negotiate as part of your individual project. But absolutely what you should be doing is mapping those things so that you understand what it is today and what it is likely to be at the next stage. So, in relation to Rodney's particular project, this is the power and interest grid. So Dottie is most likely to be the sponsor. She's the lead for the clinician workforce from a professional nursing perspective. She also, in this instance or this example, has operational responsibility. So she's got a lot at stake in terms of this project. I've assessed her interest as medium, however, because this is not the only research project that she's been asked to support. And while she's absolutely interested in research, she's got limited time in terms of how invested she is in the outcomes because, she's supporting lots of projects. Charlie from clinical governance, absolutely, he has high power in this situation. Clinical governance with the stroke of a pen can say yes or no, in the same way that Freddie from finance with the stroke of a pen can say yes or no. Charlie's very passionate about research, but in terms of his current priorities, the actual research topic is not really high on his priority. So his interest is particularly low. And I'll explain why that makes a difference shortly. Again, Freddie from finance doesn't have any interest in research. He's interested in dollars and numbers. And so his interest is low. Harry from HREC, power is high. He can determine your ethics application. And he also has high interest, particularly at the stage prior to your ethics application and providing ethics approval. Harry's interest could change once that process has been completed. Polly, the patient, unfortunately, has limited power at this stage of the project, but she's extremely interested in what this might mean for the treatment that she might receive and those music vouchers that she's going to get if she complies with the research study. And Sally's got low power. She can provide you with a lot of numbers, but she doesn't really have influence over the final determination. And she's not particularly interested in this project, but she's useful to you because you can get information from her. So who are we going to prioritise to engage with first? Which two people? Please put some suggestions in the chat for me. Okay, I've got Dottie, Harry, Polly. Harry and Dottie, probably Harry and Polly. Yeah. And it may be different depending on your context. So the conversations that you're having locally and what you know about your stakeholders will influence which people you engage first. This is why it's not up to me to tell you what that should look like. It's just to make suggestions and the considerations that you should take into account. So the first person you need to talk to is the person you've identified as most likely to be your sponsor. Now, people might say you should do the high power, high interest first, but in this particular circumstance, unless you've got Dottie's support, you're not getting anywhere near Harry. Because unless Dottie says that you can progress with your research proposal and you can develop it to the point where you can make an ethics application, then Harry doesn't even factor in. She's the line professional manager of the researcher and the supporting workforce in this example, and so she's the permission giver. She's also responsible for patient care delivery. So what happens to Polly is absolutely Dottie's business on a day-to-day basis, and she's got the most to gain or lose from success or failure of the study. It's her area of the business. She's responsible for the clinical services and for the staff. In this circumstance that I've said, engage with Harry second. Harry's got high power, high interest. He can provide you valuable advice and support pre-ethics application. So what are the pitfalls? Are there any existing research studies out there that he knows about that could help you develop further? He's a key decision maker. So engaging early to allow the influence over research design and your ethics application, addressing those barriers early will increase your chance of success. Harry's level of interest is likely to change post-ethics approval, so when you remap, you might categorise him differently. So what does that look like when you put the power and influence and the level of stakeholder interest into the matrix? So this is Rodney's first power and interest grid. So you can see over in the top right-hand corner, the two people who are most important right now for this stage of our stakeholder engagement is Dottie, who is going to be the sponsor, and Harry, who's going to give us our ethics approval. Where we've got low level of interest, but we've got high power, people who can make decisions as to whether we proceed or not, such as Charlie in clinical governance and Freddie in finance, what we need to do is meet their needs. So we don't necessarily need to manage them closely like we do our sponsor, but we do need to understand what they need from us in order to provide that support. And so we absolutely focus on understanding what their needs are and meeting them. We don't necessarily want to go any further than that. That's probably just going to be annoying for them. Busy people with limited time, they essentially want you to cover off on all of the governance, compliance, whatever their concerns are, and then for you to get on and deliver your project. We've got poor old Sally, the statistician, down in the bottom left-hand corner, and we've got Polly over on the right-hand side, very, very interested, waiting to hear when she's going to get her first voucher. So we've got Dottie on board, we've got Harry on board. We're taking our revised proposal to Charlie in clinical governance to talk to him about the idea. So Rodney explains his idea. Charlie's keen. He likes research, he wants to promote research, but he's got concerns. So he's got a concern about sustainability of the project. How's that going to affect patient care and patient outcomes if we can't continue the incentives There's a bit of money involved in providing music vouchers. And he's also concerned about the risk to patient safety if people would start to input false readings. So they might not actually take the reading, they might just put some numbers into the system in order to get access to the vouchers. That's a significant patient risk. What should Rodney do? Make your suggestions in the chat. There's somebody here who's way ahead of me with the suggestions. So Charlie, consider how Charlie's concerns can be mitigated in the design, request a photo be uploaded of the reading, apply a control measure, meet with Charlie face-to-face. All very, very good suggestions, all relevant. Again, you do what's most appropriate for you. Brainstorm some solutions. I like that one. What's Charlie's ideas as to what we could do to improve the study design? So Rodney's listened to Charlie. He's adapted his research design to ensure that the patient uploads a picture of the blood pressure reading into the system, which somebody said in the chat, well done, on the same page there. And he's agreed with Charlie that he will seek ways to sustain the incentive system beyond the life of the study. Charlie's now agreed to support the proposal, and Rodney is off to see Freddie Finance about funding. And that's really where the fun begins. So that brings me to the end of the example. Obviously, you can repeat that cycle for every single stakeholder in terms of how you engage, how you listen, understand concerns from their perspective, how you continue to engage and manage that potential resistance by allowing influence, by providing information, and by the way that you communicate with people. So there's a couple of tricks and tools here and a couple of resources. I promise you the link for the ACI accelerated implementation methodology, which if you really want to understand how people behave during change processes and what you can do to manage that, the 2-day AIM course is a good starter for people. So that's the third link that you'll see on the screen there. There's also a couple of websites there. There are many, there are hundreds of websites that have got information around stakeholder mapping, but the Research to Action and the Simply Stakeholders website, I've got some really simple tools, some really good blog articles that you can read and get some more information about where you might start with this. But a couple of tips and tricks: give yourself a time limit. Don't think that you've got to do all of your stakeholder mapping, all of your brainstorming in one go. Set yourself a time limit, know when to stop. You can end up with thousands of stakeholders. You're not going to be able to get through all of them and pay them all the same amount of attention. Get some friends to map with you, have a conversation about that. Troubleshooting and bouncing ideas off other people is always a way to get a better insight into where your kind of blockers and barriers might come from. Record your conversation. Sometimes it's not possible, particularly when conversation is flowing, when you're doing mapping in a group, that you record everything and you might miss important things. So actually record the conversation and go back. There might be some pearls of wisdom in there which you didn't quite hear at the time the conversation was happening. Ditch the piece of paper. You don't have to do this on butcher's paper. Get creative. Use different ways of doing things. There's some really good examples of the way that you can actually brainstorm and do stakeholder mapping. And then probably my favourite is if you really get stuck with mapping your stakeholders and you're really struggling to understand what their interests might be, what the impact might be for them and where the resistance might come from, think about who their stakeholders are. So what is the job that they do and who do they interact most with? So if we think about Charlie governance in the example, he's obviously responsible for clinical safety in the organisation. So he's got regulatory people he needs to think out about. He's probably dealing with lawyers. He's dealing with patient complaints. He's got, the ACI, the Centre for Clinical Agency for Clinical Innovation and the Clinical Excellence Commission. I get my acronyms right. So think about his stakeholders in terms of what's important to them. So if it's important to them, it's important to Charlie. That's how you can actually start to work out where resistance might come from, how you assess impact, and how you can then determine the conversation you need to have with Charlie. And that's me. I have left a little bit of time for questions and discussion. Apologies. It was always going to be a challenge to get through the material in the hour. I hope that you have found that a useful introduction. I think we are going to share the slides with people. It will obviously be available on YouTube if you want to circle back to that. But if there are any pressing questions, I'm hoping Zoe's going to tell us that we've got a little bit of time. Thanks, everybody.
We do, and thank you, Nicola. That was an absolute fantastic introduction to stakeholder mapping and a whirlwind trip. A question that came in quite early that I might get you to have a go at. So is there any differences or overlap between stakeholder engagement and co-design?
Yes. So absolutely there is overlap, and absolutely there are differences. So it really depends on what is the project that you're embarking on. So if you are embarking on a co-design project, then of course the people involved in that co-design are absolutely stakeholders. But they are also become responsible as part of the co-design for engaging with other stakeholders. So they are stakeholders, but then as the co-design, with the co-design approach, they then become part of the cohort that would go out and potentially consult with other stakeholders, if that makes sense. So co-design is, I guess, for want of a better explanation, a method of stakeholder engagement, but it is much more than that. It's about really allowing the influence from stakeholders to determine and dictate where a particular project might go. If it doesn't allow that influence, then my view is it's not true co-design. So you can have consultation and influence into a project, whether it be a research project, a development of a model of care or whatever. But if you're really starting with a blank sheet of paper and allowing a co-design model to influence and build what that looks like from the ground up, it's much more than stakeholder engagement. That's a really short answer to a very complex subject. So I hope that that kind of does that justice, but integrated, but some very, very important differences, I think, between the two.
Excellent. Thank you, Nicola. And it's an introductory session, so I think that's a good starting point to addressing that complex question. Another question that came in, what about the voiceless stakeholders? So the people that have issues with power or gender or hidden in any given area or process. And the attendee just sort of suggested, so culturally and linguistically diverse populations, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, refugees, children versus their parents. So how you navigate that sort of process.
Yeah. Again, a complex question without a very easy answer. I think the first step to meaningful stakeholder engagement with people who don't necessarily have a voice that's heard very easily is to understand who they are. And that can be at a superficial surface level to begin with. Navigating then how you develop engagement mechanisms which allows you access to those people in order to allow them the opportunity to have a voice, whatever that mechanism might look like, is a challenge that we face every day, and I don't think we have necessarily cracked that one. So if you are working with, so, you know, for example, you're dealing with a particular clinical service and you know you have a high population in that area of people from non-English speaking background, for example, knowing what stakeholders, the way you would map your stakeholders is to identify that group first of all, but then also identify the organisations, the people, the community advocates, the access points into that community also as stakeholders, so that you create that hierarchy is the wrong word, but a matrix of relationships and connections which can then facilitate access to get the information that you need, which is going to be really important. We've also got to be mindful of the fact that there are groups of people who are suspicious of public service, who don't engage easily for whatever reason, people with particular life experiences, particular trauma, etc. That's a conversation we've absolutely not got time to go into today, but understanding that that is a potential factor for your project is the first step to actually starting to generate, I guess, engagement mechanisms which might be useful. I don't think any of us have got that perfect.
Thank you, Nicola. Excellent response. And also thank you, a shout out to Amanda, who pointed the person who asked the question to, there's a useful framework from AHMRC as well around the inclusion of working with people with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander to embark on research from an ethical point of view. So that's really great to see other people providing suggestions.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I saw that pop up in the chat. That's a great research.
Excellent. So just to start to wrap up this session, we'd like to thank you all for attending. As always, please let us.
I think you just put yourself on.
You're just muted. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Thank you so much for that, Nicola. Everyone, the feedback's been wonderful so far. Just to wrap up today's session, thank you very much for attending, and please let us know how you went. We always want to make sure that we're meeting your needs, and if you're able to complete that short evaluation survey, that would be fabulous. And on behalf of the Rural Research Collaborative Learning Network, thank you so much for your engagement in 2024. And we look forward to bringing you an action-packed schedule of events for 2025. In case you're not able to wait, we do have our first session for 2025 lined up already. This session is going to be run on Wednesday, the 5th of February, and it's going to be run by Dr. Rebecca Venciarati. Cause and effect and introduction to epidemiology. So get that booked into your calendar, and we look forward to seeing you all in 2025. Thank you so much for attending.
Thanks, everybody.